Good morning, everybody. You are very welcome to this EirWind Research Project webinar. I hope it's as beautiful a morning wherever you are as it is here in Cork this morning. The sun is shining. We're absolutely thrilled that we have over 300 participants online with us here this morning, and a fantastic opportunity to showcase the EirWind Research Project. Next slide, Michael. So we would like to present the results of 2 years of research through the EirWind project, which essentially was designed to look at development pathways for offshore wind in Ireland using a multidisciplinary research approach. Next. And in terms of a little bit of context for what you're about to hear today, the background to the EirWind project emerged about 2.5 years ago when some strategic thinkers, including Eamon McKeough, Gerhard at the time from Statoil, now Equinor, and Niamh Kenny from DP were instrumental in working together to formalise a research programme that would bring new knowledge to bear in relation to realising the opportunity for offshore wind in Ireland. And prior to that, research into offshore wind was relatively piecemeal, and the MaREI Centre of Excellence became a fantastic mechanism through Science Foundation Ireland and industry collaboration to envisage a strategic research project with potential for significant impact in terms of policy and industry in the offshore wind sector. What I would say is, in the last 2 years of this project, there have been dramatic changes. We'll just go back to the previous slide for a second. In terms of those changes and the context that we've seen massive progress in relation to technology, huge progress in relation to cost reductions in this offshore wind sector. We've seen new projects coming on stream in Ireland, particularly in the Irish Sea. We've seen new entrants into the market. And really significantly, we've seen major developments at the government policy level, very significantly in terms of Ireland's Climate Action Plan, which set a target for 3.5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And in particular, the programme for government, which we're all waiting to hear the outcome of in the next day or so, which could potentially raise that target to 5 gigawatts by the end of this decade. We've also seen at a government level the National Marine Planning Framework, huge work been done just in the last couple of years of the EirWind project on the drafting of the Marine Planning and Development Management Bill, and a whole range of activity, which essentially means that we're progressing extremely rapidly in this area. Peter Coyle from the Marine Renewables Industry Association has basically said that what we're seeing is a marine policy revolution and an Irish awakening with regards to offshore wind. And I think one would have to agree with that synopsis. So in short, we've got one of the best offshore wind resources in the world. We've come from a relatively slow starting position, but as I've outlined, just in the duration of the EirWind project, things have progressed extremely rapidly. Just in the last couple of days, EY produced the results of their biannual analysis with regards to the Energy Country Attractiveness Index. Ireland now is 12 in the top 12 out of 40, up 12 places in the last 2 years. And so we know that we have an opportunity to learn from other jurisdictions, potentially to be totally self-sufficient in energy, and if we take offshore wind into consideration, even an energy exporter. So this is the context for the EirWind project, and it's also the context in which we find ourselves now and how things have changed so much over the last couple of years. Next slide. So we've brought new knowledge to bear on this opportunity, and that's what we're going to present to you this morning. We've had a tremendous opportunity to build a large research team, thanks to the funding from Science Foundation Ireland, administered through the MaREI Centre, and the funding that we've had from the industry consortium. So the industry members include Equinor, DP Energy, Enerco, Statkraft, Brookfield, EDPR, ENGIE, SSE Renewables, Simply Blue Energy and ESB. And we've had this wonderful opportunity to work with this consortium as well as with the research team and a technical advisory group with members from government departments and agencies to look at questions with regards to a whole range of areas, including ecosystems governance, markets, infrastructure and storage, cost optimization, and looking at data and GIS. Jimmy Murphy has co-led this project with me. And Jimmy is the co-principal investigator, and we have a number of work package leaders and researchers that have been housed through MaREI with academic contributions from University College Cork, from my own school of BEES, Biological Earth and Environmental Science, Engineering, Economics, Sociology and Statistics. So a huge collaborative effort between UCC and MaREI in relation to the delivery of this project, and uniquely with our industry consortium and advisors. Next slide. So today we're going to present the results of that effort. To complete the introduction, Dr. Nguyen Din, who's a senior research fellow in MaREI and also plays the role very effectively of EirWind project manager, will take you through the overview and studies and reports that have underpinned the research, and that will be available upon final publication of the project. And then we'll have technical presentations in relation to data management from Jared Peters, on cost optimization from Jimmy Murphy, on governance and biology from Sarah Candrett, on markets from Paul Leahy, and then the research synthesis presented by myself on behalf of myself and Dr. Eamon McKeough. And then we're really fortunate that we'll have a commentary from industry experts and from the department in terms of what has been presented from EirWind this morning. So that should take us up to about 12 or 12:30 at the absolute latest. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nguyen, but what I would say is that all of the research team are online. While we can't all present, the research team are at your disposal via the meeting chat. So please feel free to use the chat room to ask questions, and I'll do my best during the course of the morning to pick up on some of those questions and to be able to deliver them to the speakers on your behalf. We'll also be recording this session and making the full session available after the event, along with slides and the responses to all of the questions that are being posed. So we're delighted once again to welcome everybody. I'll hand over now to my colleague Nguyen Din to take you through an overview of the project outputs. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nguyen Din. I'm giving you the overview of the project research process and deliverable, and how we ensure the quality, efficiency, and practice of the research. In the next slide. So in this slide, you will see a research process, how we ensure the quality, efficiency, and practice. Every research, we need a number of steps, from identify the challenge, design research question, implement, validate the research outcome, and disseminate. And most of the research steps, we will need not only research team, but other stakeholders. So very fortunately, in EirWind, we have most of the stakeholders in the consortium, including industry partner, research team, technical advisor from governmental agencies. So every consortium meeting, we organize policy update, industry update to provide more up-to-date and practice to the research team. Also, we organize deliverable and work plan presentation for the industry and advisor to provide feedback to the work plan and draft report. Also, we organize laboratory and facility visit and working plan to promote more collaboration among industry partners, also to showcase MaREI Center and UCC laboratory and infrastructure. Also, we invited a number of speakers on grid, offshore development, marine space planning, and so on to give lecture and presentation for the consortium. During the implementation process, we maximize the research industry interaction through online individual email team. Also, we organize online forum to Jammer, where we upload draft report, draft publication for the industry and consortium to review, provide feedback very timely. Also, there's a place where we can provide data practice for the research team. And every consortium meeting we organize every 3 months, where we can validate our research outcome and the work plan for the next deliverable. Also, we are disseminating our research findings through different channels. And moreover, in EirWind, we can see it's a multidisciplinary and very interactive environment when everyone can build upon further capacity in different research areas. You can see in the next slide. So in this slide, you can see that we not only efficient and qualified and practical, but we are producing 40 reports from 5 research areas by July within 2 years. In 5 years, including data and GIS can be reported to you by Dr. Jared Peter, cost optimization can be by Dr. Jimmy Murphy, and governance and marine biology can be reported by Dr. Sarah Kenrod. Also, market, infrastructure, and economic can be given you by Dr. Pollehy. You can find EirWind outcome publication through the EirWind website at www.marei.ie/project/EirWind. By July, there will be more publication and outcome to be published through website. Also, you can visit EirWind LinkedIn to see recent update. And the next presentation, I would like to introduce Dr. Jared Peter.
Thank you, Nguyen, for that very comprehensive overview. So as Nguyen said, today's session is really a taster in relation to the work that has been undertaken in EirWind. The detailed reports and studies will be accessible through the website. And to give a flavour for the work done in Work Package 2 in relation to data management, Jared Peters is going to take us through that. Jared has been working as a postdoc researcher on this work package, which is led by Professor Andy Wheeler from BEES.
Thanks, Val. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As Val said, I'm Jared, and I'm really excited to be able to share the work we've done here in Work Package 2. And I think to start things off, I'll just go straight to the next slide and say that I'll be saying we a lot during this presentation. And that's because I was really honored to be part of a great team. We had a lot of strong researchers on this work package. As Val said, the work package leader is Andy Wheeler. I was the postdoctoral researcher, and we've had 3 really talented research assistants over the course of the project. Currently, Felix Butchik is working with us, and previously we've had Teeny Rimmers and Ross O'Connell as well, and all of them worked really hard and were very talented, so thanks to them. Now, in the next slide, just so you know what you're in store for here in my presentation today, I've broken things down into 4 topics. We'll start by talking about the data resource management itself, and then go into data collection, some data modeling, and finally I'll talk about the geospatial multi-criteria decision aid, or MCDA, that we were able to construct in this work package. Next slide. So in order to make data resource management as exciting as possible, or as interesting as possible, I'm just going to present the results from 3 reviews we've done over the course of this project. And the first thing we did near the beginning of the project was an initial data availability review, and that resulted in the publication of a policy brief, which is where this figure is from. And really the main takeaway from this was that we started to identify some serious data gaps. As you can see in the chart, the omission bars are they're the worst in the geological data, and so we started to get an idea of where we needed to make improvements. The next slide. After a year of research, we had to do a similar review again because a lot of improvements have been made, and these were from Irish efforts like Infomar project and European-wide efforts like eModNet, but also because of the work we were doing in EirWind, and that's what these charts are showing you here. So the pie charts on the right are showing you 3 categories of GIS data, and the green pie slices are the actual contributions from the EirWind project. These funky triangular radar plots are showing you the types of improvements that we made to the data. They have nothing to do with the magnitude of improvement, but the red triangle shows you the original state of the data. And for instance, you can see on the bottom triangle, for several types of data, we were able to improve coverage, resolution, and the compatibility of those data with other data sets. In the next slide, please. All these reviews culminated in the publication of a peer-reviewed paper, and this was a systematic review and meta-analysis of GIS use for offshore wind energy research. And that's what these figures are from. And what they're showing you is that we were really able to start to pick out some overall trends in the research. So the bottom pie charts there are showing you different types of research we were able to identify. And of course, the map on the right is showing you where all these studies were coming from. In the next slide, after all these reviews, it started to become apparent where the data gaps were in need of actual data input. And so we started going offshore and collecting new data ourselves to improve these data gaps. We conducted cruises, 3 cruises aboard the Marine Institute's research vessel, the Celtic Voyager, which is the boat here in the bottom left. All told, we were offshore for 21 days, and some of those days were gorgeous, as you can see in the photo on top. That's a picture I snapped of a sediment grab returning to the ship with a sample of the seabed. Unfortunately, many of those days were horrible and looked more like the picture you see on the right, which I snapped out of a porthole. But you'll see in the next slide that despite the bad weather, we were fairly successful and did manage to collect a lot of data. The map on the right is showing you where we collected these data. We were able to collect more than 400 nautical miles of multi-beam bathymetry, roughly along the track line shown on the green line on the map. We also collected about 200 sediment grabs and over 30 vibrocores. And the sediment grabs, there's an example of one on the left here. That's what they look like when they return to the ship. And to see what they look like when we turn them into data, we go to the next slide. And this is where we really started to take our new data and existing data and make new models that would be more useful for our overall MCDA. So what you see in the map on the left are all the point data that we used for a geological model that we made, and there are almost 2,000 data points on that map. And what we did was we coded physical property values for the sediments in those samples, and then we added some geomorphological data to represent what the seabed looks like. And we built a model for what the probability for stability would be along the seabed for the entire continental shelf, which is what you see in the map on the right. But we made several other models. I'll just give you in the next slide some examples. So these maps are depicting data sets that were used in making new models. The wave data that you see in the bottom left is ERA5 data. That's not our own model, but we used it with some of our own models, like the distance to ports model you see on the right. Felix was able to use these data to help improve models for O&M windows. This is operation and maintenance weather windows, essentially, because when the weather is too rough or the waves are too big, you're not able to safely transfer crew to do maintenance on the turbines. It's important to understand how often you'll actually be able to access these offshore turbines. Felix also made some important advances to the actual models of the wind resource. And Teeny made some really great advances on the models for visual impact. This is models of the actual changes that are likely to occur to the seascape, to what it looks like when you look out at the ocean. And Teeny was the first person to model the visual impact for Ireland using state-of-the-art technology. The turbines that we're using nowadays are much bigger than they used to be, so you need to change these models over time. And her model also includes data input from what the weather changes mean for horizontal visibility, which is really important here in Ireland, as you can imagine. Next slide. After we had all our new data and all our new data models, we were able to start working on our actual MCDA, or multi-criteria decision aid. And the first thing we did was define what criteria we wanted to use. And for this, our published review was really important. That's what this chart on the left is showing you. It's showing the 20 most common GIS parameters used in the literature to study offshore wind energy. We went a bit above and beyond and used 162 criteria in our model. And so this made things more thorough, but it also made things more complicated. In order to make it more usable for ourselves and anyone else who may use it in the future, we designed the model to consist of sort of preliminary GIS models that are then combined in the MCDA. We identified 3 different types of models: constraints, restrictions, and opportunities. Constraints are things like pre-existing structures, for example, like you're not going to put a wind farm on an oil platform or over a buried cable. You just don't build there. And restrictions would be things like habitats that are important for protected marine life. You avoid these whenever possible, obviously. And opportunities would be things like the actual wind resource itself. So keeping all that in mind, we'll go to the next slide. And while all these criteria are important, they're not equally important. So one of the more important things we did for this study was we weighted the relative importance of these variables next to each other. And to do this, I surveyed 25 experts from industry and academia, and I took their survey responses and I scored them with analytical hierarchy process, which adds a numerical value to an otherwise qualitative response. That's what these charts are showing you here. And I'll just point out before we move on that, as you can see in the bottom chart, the more important responses, the criteria that were deemed more important, were also really low on standard deviation. So there was high agreement with what was important, and that's obviously a good outcome. So now I'll just wrap things up in the next slide. I'm just going to summarize here all the things we were able to output in this project. Obviously, data management was an ongoing effort, and as we made new data, it needed to be categorized and standardized and compiled. But throughout that, we completed important reviews which identified data gaps and established standards from the literature. We also added new data. We filled data gaps with measurements and samples and models. And then we weighted all the data with expert surveys and brand new AHP calculations. And finally, we constructed our MCDA. And this is a modular model. It's adjustable, it's weighted and modern. And what I mean by that is all the data is as up to date as possible, but it also considers state-of-the-art technology. So really large 12 megawatt turbines were assumed for building our model. And what this all produces is a map, a raster, or gridded data that covers the entire continental shelf, where each cell in that grid is providing a numerical value for how likely that area is to be a good opportunity for offshore wind energy development. Next slide, please. So with that, I'd just say thanks, and if I have time, I'll answer a question.
Thanks a million, Jared. That was very comprehensive, and you said at the start your challenge was to make data exciting. I certainly think you brought it to life with the visuals that you showed. And clearly data is an absolutely critical vector in the development of offshore wind. So the comprehensive review of the data that is available for this sector and the work that you've done through Work Package 2 building up a GIS of up to 162 different data layers, identifying gaps and making recommendations, is all captured in relation to the reports coming out of the project. What I would like to remind the audience is the fact that you are invited to use the chat to pose questions. We'd be delighted to pick up on questions as we go forward. So just remind people that we'd like to activate that. But what we'll do now is we'll move on, Jared. Thank you. And we'll move over to Jimmy Murphy. Jimmy is the co-PI of the EirWind project, as well as leader of Work Package 3 on development optimization for cost reduction. Thanks, Jimmy. Over to you.
All right, thank you, Val, and welcome everybody to this webinar. So I'm going to talk about something maybe totally different to what Jared talked about, I suppose, and that's development optimization and cost reduction. So if we move to the next slide, please. So I'll just start by acknowledging the team that works on this, and their work is what I am presenting today. So it's, you know, primarily Fiona who worked on this diligently, and Francis and Kian and Prasad and Rachel as well, who has now left us, but she was here at the early stages of the project. So what I'm going to talk about is cost reduction, and I suppose, you know, cost reduction has been the focus of the offshore wind sector since the earliest stages, and thus far the industry has far outstripped all expectations and predictions in terms of what could be achieved. And I suppose when we look at the reasons for that, I've included these on the slide here. You know, so they obviously relate to the scaling up of the industry to larger projects using bigger turbines that are more efficient and more reliable. So you're building less turbines offshore, and you're servicing them less frequently. Obviously, as the industry matures, you know, sort of the risk reduces, so the cost of capital reduces as well. So that obviously has a big impact on the cost reductions. And also, you know, sort of when there's more certainty in the sector in relation to the pipeline of projects, that allows the supply chain to develop and flourish, and that has a knock-on effect then of cost reductions. And then the final 2 points relate to, you know, sort of the experience in developing and installing and operating offshore wind farms. You know, as you do that more often, you learn how to do it better and quicker, more efficiently, and obviously that really results in cost reduction. So when we turn to Ireland and the EirWind project and what that's hoping to achieve, you know, sort of, you know, if we put the Arklow project aside, the initial phase 1 project, you know, so we're only now starting on our journey in exploiting offshore wind. So what we wanted to understand is, given specific Irish conditions, what can we expect to achieve in terms of levelized cost of energy, you know, for different sites around the coast of Ireland, you know, primarily the east coast in the Irish Sea, the south coast in the Celtic Sea, and in the Atlantic Ocean on the west coast. So if you move to the next slide. So, you know, we cannot talk about cost reduction without mentioning or focusing on LCOE, the levelized cost of energy. So I'll just explain this here because I'll be using it quite a lot within the talk. So levelized cost of energy, intuitively, it's an easy concept to understand in terms of you take all the expenditure in the project, the development expenditure, capital expenditure, operational expenditure, and decommissioning expenditure, and you divide it by the lifetime power production, and you come out with a parameter which has units for us here in the Eurozone of either euros per megawatt hour or euros per kilowatt hour. In this talk, I'll just use euros per megawatt hour as the units. So if you look at the two slides at the bottom, you can see that, you know, sort of the LCOE is a measure of the progress of the offshore wind sector, and it's an indicator of what can be achieved in the future. So if you take the left-hand slide there, you can see for fixed offshore wind, you know, what is predicted for 2030 is that the cost, the LCOE, will have about quartered from the 2015 value, and that's really significant and outstanding, you know, sort of achievement for the industry itself, that it can reach these levels of cost reduction. When you look on the right hand side for floating offshore wind, you know, the sector is less mature, so we don't know exactly what can be achieved yet, but they have very ambitious targets. You know, there's only a few small projects being constructed so far, you know, and they're going from a base of maybe in 2017 of 200 euros per megawatt hour, and they're hoping by 2030 to reach a value of 50 euros per megawatt hour. So again, that's very, very demanding, and you know, sort of in terms of targets, it will be very hard to achieve, maybe, you know. So we'll see. So if we move to the next slide. So how do we calculate LCOE? You know, sort of, I suppose what LCOE is sort of, it's a relatively simple concept, but you know, sort of in relation to its determination, it's much more complicated, and it can be calculated with various degrees of sophistication. You know, sort of, you see some models and they use very baseline or high-level assumptions in terms of, you know, sort of assuming average costs per megawatt, or assuming OPEX is a proportion of CAPEX. You know, what we've done here in UCC is we've, over the last 5 years, been developing an LCOE model that we are trying to make as granular as possible in terms of our inputs, you know, sort of our calculations, and then our outputs as well. So we're trying to break down all the processes and operations within the wind farm life cycle as fine as possible, and working out the resources required, the costs, the time durations of those tasks, and then coming up with a breakdown of the costs at the end of the model. You know, so that's the basis of our model. So if we move to the next slide. I'll just mention another model that we have developed in UCC as part of this project. You know, sort of, it's an O&M expert model, and what that does is that it tries to optimize the O&M strategy for a particular wind farm. There are various ways and means of servicing wind turbines, and this tool seeks to optimize the strategy that's employed, you know, so optimize costs. So to the next slide. So I suppose this is where we get down to the work in the EirWind project. You know, so 2 years ago, the consortium sat down and we tried to devise case studies that were representative of Ireland and the development pathway that Ireland might take. You know, and I have to say, you know, sort of, even looking at some of the assumptions now, 2 years on, we may have been a bit conservative, you know, sort of, but you know, sort of, this is a case of trying to predict where the industry will be at certain points in time, and making the best estimate that you can. So the closer you are to the present, obviously, the better your assumptions can be. So for instance, if we take the RSC, that's obviously closer to development and commercialization. So we're looking at, you know, sort of project maybe of 500 megawatts in, you know, sort of starting in 2025, you know, sort of using fixed foundations, XL monopiles. When we look at the Celtic Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, you know, we're looking further ahead because we see much of the development taking place, you know, sort of in the RSC for the next decade, and big developments may not happen in those locations until the 2030s. You know, and you see that we've used 12 and 14 megawatt turbines for those case studies, and it could be that at that stage we're at 20 megawatt plus turbines, or that our discount rates are lower than 6%. But you know, sort of, we don't know exactly what the conditions will be at that time. We just have to be solid in what our assumptions are now and know what we have done. You know, if you look back, an LCOE predicted 5 or 6 years ago for 2020, it's obviously a lot different. You know, sort of, it's a lot lower now than what was predicted back then. So we see this as the best sort of estimate given our knowledge at this point in time. So if we move to the next slide. This just shows some of the output of the model, you know, so I suppose, you know, there's a lot of information here, but it breaks down all the costs into its various elements. I suppose, you know, just picking a few items, if you're developing your RSC wind farm, your 492 megawatts, you might have some change out of 2 billion euro, and your LCOE values, you know, sort of are very positive from what we see. You know, we see a value of 65 euros per megawatt hour, which sort of is very much in line with what an industry is predicting at the moment. When we go to the Celtic Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, obviously the LCOE values are higher, and I suppose just to point to the Atlantic Ocean one in particular, you know, sort of, you know, that has the highest value, but it's still, you know, sort of from what we were expecting initially, it is lower You know, so we were quite pleased with what figures that you can achieve in Irish scenarios. But I suppose the Atlantic Ocean, there's significant room for improvement, because if you look at the availability in terms of the turbines, you see it's down at 68%, and what you would be hoping for was more than 90%. So if you can get that figure up, obviously your LCOE value would reduce. So the next slide, please. So when we run the baseline model cases, we're looking at optimization. So we've covered the big ticket items already in the calculations that we've done. So now we're looking at seeing, can we refine and improve our LCOE calculations by varying various processes during the life cycle of the wind farm. So obviously this one here is looking at the methods and the vessels you use to install your turbines. If you go to the next slide. This slide here is looking at the O&M methods, you know, whether you use SOVs, CTVs, helicopters, your heavy lift vessels, your combination of vessels, and the type of O&M strategy you employ. So if you look at varying those, you know, they can have a significant effect on your LCOE. And then the next slide. And then, you know, sort of floating wind platforms, you know, sort of they can vary, you know, sort of in type as well. You know, sort of this sector isn't as developed, so there's no sort of clear technology that we know will be the main runner in the future. You know, there's different types of technologies, and you say, if you know, we look at the semi-sub technology, that's the forerunner at the moment. But there are other technologies. There's a spar, we all know about the spar technology, but there's also, if you look at the bottom left, there's the semi-spar or the pendulum type concept, and that concept there, you know, sort of there's a project ongoing in Ireland at the moment that, you know, sort of to install a 6 megawatt pendulum off the Mayo Coast and the Amets test site. And finally, you know, sort of what we're looking at as well in our optimizations is the use of different materials. You know, sort of there is much opportunity for the Irish supply chain if we're working with steel, but if we work more with concrete and see concrete semi-subs or concrete platforms, then obviously they could be manufactured in Ireland rather than just being imported. So what impact do they have on the LCOE? So if we move to the next slide. You know, so this just summarizes the various, you know, sort of optimizations that we have done within the project. You know, sort of so I suppose I've talked about these already. You know, so what I haven't mentioned maybe is, you know, improving the reliability of the platforms. If you're moving to more extreme environments, your turbines need to be more reliable. And also, you know, sort of if we take floating platforms, when you are in Atlantic environments and you have a major component failure, do you tow it back to the port, or do you try and fix it offshore? Which is the better strategy to employ? You know, so if you move to the next slide, then, you know, so these are the results of the optimization. So I haven't shown everything here. I've just shown, you know, sort of some of the figures, you know, sort of from some of the optimization. So I haven't categorized each specific optimization, but if you look in general, you know, sort of what we found is that, you know, sort of you can achieve significant reductions in LCOE. You know, so when you're talking about these projects, these are multi-billion euro projects. So, you know, if you can achieve a 10% reduction in LCOE, that's a significant savings. You know, and you can see for the Atlantic Ocean site, you know, there's the potential, if you improve the reliability and your access strategies to the platforms, you can achieve, you know, sort of a 22% reduction in LCOE. So if we go to the next slide. So just in terms of the key findings, you know, sort of this study, you know, sort of the Irish Sea results, they show why fixed sites using well-established technology and methods have been prioritised for offshore development in Ireland. You know, sort of that's what we see at the moment, is that, you know, sort of all the activity, or the majority of the activity in the next decade, is going to be on the East Coast sites with fixed platforms, and that's the most benign environment in the Irish waters for developing wind farms, and it's obviously closest to the market as well. You know, if we look at the Celtic Sea, that indicates very high potential for floating wind, but we see it happening over a longer time scale. You know, sort of we see some development happening in the next decade, hopefully in the Celtic Sea, but, you know, sort of the big projects may not happen until the 2030s. And the Atlantic Ocean site is feasible. I think, sort of for them to be as cost effective, you need more advancement and development of the sector itself in working in more extreme environments to get the LCOE value down to levels comparable to fixed wind. And finally, I would say that, sort of the cost reductions, sort of further cost reductions and optimizations are possible by examining each individual stage of the life cycle and trying to optimize it for that particular site you're developing on. So last slide. So thanks everybody, sort of that's the work we have done, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great, Jimmy. Thanks a million. And that was a very comprehensive overview of the huge body of work that's been done in Work Package 3. I think the results are very encouraging. I think that the high level message in terms of the Irish Sea production zone, and then for bottom fixed and opening up the Celtic Sea and the Atlantic in terms of floating is coming across, as well as that critical message, I think, in terms of, I was struck by your comment that the assumptions that we made just 2 years ago might even appear conservative now, indicative of just how quickly that this whole area is changing. So that was a really good taster of the detailed work that's been done. And I can see now I've accessed the chat room, and there's questions coming in thick and fast, and I know our researchers are looking at addressing those as much as possible. But for you now, Jimmy, I just picked out one question there, which is, how does your approach and output compare with other studies that calculate LCOE?
Okay, so LCOE can be calculated in a number of different ways, sort of, and nearly everybody have an LCOE model. So I suppose it was very important to us to make sure our figures were comparable with what was calculated by other groups and the industry itself. And the EirWind Consortium was very helpful to us in that respect, in terms of looking at our approach and our methods to make sure we were in line with what they had done. Obviously, a big issue with calculation of LCOE for, say, universities like us, is that we don't have access to the detailed data, so we have to use assumptions and publish data in terms of a lot of the figures involved. And I suppose we got sanity checks on all those figures, and as well as that, as part of another project, we consulted with ORE Catapult, and they obviously, sort of validated our approach as well. So we're satisfied that our methodology and our results are in line with what has been produced elsewhere, and you can see the figures themselves there. They are matching what you see out there in terms of what industry is producing. So we're happy with the results that have been produced.
Thanks, Jimmy. We'll leave it there. That was very good. We'll shift gear and over to something very different and extremely important. Moving away from the GIS, the engineering and the techno-economic modelling for a moment to look at ecosystems, governance and biology. I think we can safely say that while we can maybe engineer our way out of many things, that unless we don't have people on board, that progress will not be made. And we put that front and centre in terms of designing the programme for the EirWind project. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Sarah Kandrat now, who's going to walk us through the body of work and the new knowledge that has been created with regards to Work Package 4. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Val. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Sarah Kandrat, and I'm going to present to you the outputs of Work Package 4 on ecosystem governance and biology. So I'll just start by acknowledging the team. So we had a group of researchers and postdocs with Will, Emma and Mark working on biological issues, and Val, Anne-Marie, Yvonne, Jer, Mitra, Declan and myself working on governance and social issues. So for today's presentation, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of what we covered and the key research outputs that emerged from this work package. Next slide. So Ireland is home to 26 species of marine mammals, which are protected by European legislation, and fisheries are an important part of our ocean economy. So it's very important that we understand how any new developments in Irish waters could potentially impact on our fisheries and marine mammal species. So for this work, Will undertook a desk-based review of our current knowledge on the environmental impacts of offshore wind farms, and he also identified mitigation techniques that we can use to inform best practice in relation to managing these impacts. Next slide, please. So this slide very concisely summarizes his findings. Essentially, there can be both positive and negative effects on fish and marine mammals. So negative effects include things like noise from vessel and construction activities and potential entanglement in underwater cables. We also know that turbines can act as artificial reefs, increasing biodiversity and providing shelter for some species. So biological impacts of development don't necessarily have to be negative. Where those impacts are negative, there are certain measures that we can take to reduce or to eliminate them. So these include things like rules around when and where certain activities can occur, and the use of devices to deter animals from entering potentially dangerous areas. Next slide, please. So Emma looked at Irish seabird vulnerability. Again, Ireland is home to many protected species, including the Manx shearwater and the European storm petrel. So Emma's work involved developing models of seabird vulnerability in Irish waters, and these models can be used to inform planning in relation to broad-scale siting decisions. So Emma was using observational data from surveys to create maps of seabird vulnerability to collision and displacement. The maps created for the EirWind project were created at the national scale, and these are limited by data availability. But the method that Emma developed allows for more detailed maps to be created where higher resolution observational data are available, for example, at the site scale. So ultimately, these maps, sorry, can you just go back for a sec? Ultimately, the maps can be used to highlight areas where additional surveys, monitoring, tracking studies, or mitigation might be needed, and they can help to define the species and the areas that are most at risk in a potential development site. Next slide, please. So while Will was looking at the biological impacts of offshore wind on fisheries, Mitra focused on social issues in relation to fishers and how they might coexist with offshore wind farms to earn what we call social license to operate, or acceptance or approval of development by stakeholders. So Mitra interviewed 33 key stakeholders, including fishers and developers, to look at their opinions in relation to different benefit sharing mechanisms. Next slide, please. So the objective was to include a diverse group of fishers from different locations in Ireland. And you can see from the map, the red dots show the ports where the interviews were conducted. There was a good geographical spread of participants from around the country. So Mitra analysed the interview data and identified over 500 references to fishers' different priorities, and she found that there were 4 key elements that were cited the most in relation to coexistence between fishers and offshore wind, and these were trust, compensation, benefit sharing, and concerns. So there was an overall desire by fishers to be informed and also to be involved in the decision-making process. And some participants even suggested that a fisheries liaison group should be set up to facilitate this. Next slide. So the insights that Mitra gained from these interviews contributed to the development of a guide for the coexistence of commercial fishers and offshore wind developers in Ireland, and this is summarised in this slide. So this involves 3 key elements: consultation, dialogue, and active participation by stakeholders. And in this way, different stakeholder groups can develop a mutual understanding of the key concerns at the outset and then work together to address these in the early stages of development rather than further on down the road when it might be too late to come to an agreeable resolution. Next slide, please. So Yvonne looked at social license to operate in relation to the national public opinion of offshore wind. So there were 3 key strands to this work. So these were stakeholder mapping, a media content analysis, and a national survey of public opinion. Next slide, please. So the stakeholder mapping involved identification of key stakeholder groups in offshore wind and the development of a directory of stakeholders at the national level with an interest in offshore wind. So this was followed up with interviews with our industry partners to identify developers' key issues of concern in relation to governance and stakeholder engagement. And this will hopefully help to build an understanding of these issues and concerns amongst key stakeholders. Yvonne also analysed print media coverage of offshore wind in Ireland and found that people's primary source of print news influences their attitudes towards offshore wind. And she found that broadsheet readers generally were more receptive to offshore wind, with tabloid readers having more negative perceptions. So a review of 5 years of broadsheet coverage, though, it generally reflected a positive trajectory of the sector in Ireland. The third, next slide, please. So the third strand of Yvonne's work was a national survey of public perception of offshore wind. And the survey included opinions from over 1,100 respondents from across the country. The map on the right illustrates the geographical distribution of that survey, so it was geographically representative. And the results show that the Irish public are generally supportive of offshore wind development in Ireland. So 87% of respondents said that they would not object to development of an offshore wind farm in their locality, and 93% said they would not object to the development of an offshore wind farm outside their locality. So huge degree of support. Interestingly, respondents with previous exposure to offshore wind farms were more supportive of offshore wind development than those without. And more detailed information from the survey will be contained within the project reports, and this can ultimately be used to help steer public awareness campaigns. Next slide, please. And finally, we come to my own work on the socioeconomic impacts of offshore wind for Ireland. So we know from international experience that offshore wind development creates jobs and economic opportunities. But our work sought to measure the opportunity for Ireland in terms of gross value added and domestic job creation in the supply chain. So for this work, we built an economic model based on installed capacity and the ability of Irish companies to supply products and services to the sector. So next slide. We looked at two scenarios, 4.5 gigawatts and 5.3 gigawatts of installed capacity by 2030. So these graphs show annual direct and indirect jobs that would be supported by the sector out to 2035. So the green portions of the bars represent jobs that have a high likelihood of being created in Ireland, and the orange represent those that have a medium potential of being created in Ireland, provided the supply chain grows faster than we anticipate. So focusing on the high likelihood for job creation, we find that 4.5 to 5.3 gigawatts of domestic offshore wind development would support between 8,000 and almost 10,000 jobs in the domestic supply chain in 2030. And the greatest potential in those jobs is in planning and development and operations and maintenance. Next slide, please. So for the same scenarios, we also looked at GVA. And we also found that offshore wind could generate between 585 million and 689 million euros in gross value added in 2030. And that equates to a total GVA impact of over €1 billion for both scenarios over the coming decade. And this would contribute significantly to Ireland's ambition in terms of the government's Harnessing Our Ocean Wealth strategy, and that seeks to double the value of Ireland's ocean economy by 2030. Next slide, please. And finally, we looked at opportunities around regional development. So this map shows levels of social deprivation around ports with potential capabilities in offshore wind. It's one of several maps that are contained in the reports that illustrates Ireland's regional economic imbalance, so east versus west, urban versus rural. And we believe that offshore wind can help to address this and associated issues like rural depopulation and the decline of many of our coastal communities by using ports and harbours as stimulants for development to support the industry. So investment in these areas could help to address what's been a long-standing issue of sources of job creation for rural Ireland. So in our synthesis report, we look at opportunities around the emergence of port maritime clusters, specifically around Rosslare and Arklow as hubs for installation and assembly, Cork as a Celtic Sea hydrogen hub, and Shannon Foynes as an Atlantic production zone hub for manufacturing, installation and assembly. So that's everything from Work Package 4. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take a question.
Well done. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Yeah.
So what comes across very strongly from a huge body of work there, I'm just going to pick up on two things. There was one word that you mentioned that I think is so important and worth highlighting, the word trust, in relation to the work that MaREI has been doing. It's hard won, it's easily broken, and I think that it's a principle that needs to be put front and central to engagement with all stakeholders in relation to the realisation of the offshore wind opportunity for Ireland. And the second key word I would pick up from your presentation is the word opportunity. And I think that just looking at the questions that are coming in there, I'm not going to be terribly unfair and ask you a question about marine biology and pick one that's relevant to the work you've done. So a question here is, in terms of job creation potential, how do your modelled figures compare to others? For example, actual jobs created in countries with a track record of experience of offshore wind. You're still muted, Sarah.
There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, so we looked at the UK, which is currently a world leader in offshore wind development. And if we normalize the number of domestic jobs created per megawatt of installed capacity, we can actually compare our own modelled outputs with actual jobs created in the UK. And the figures were very similar. So they work out to around 1.8 to 1.9 jobs per megawatt. We also looked at other studies that were done in Ireland. And this was complicated because those studies considered different types of jobs across different geographical areas. So, for example, the whole island of Ireland versus the Republic. But where we could find, where we could make comparisons, we generally found that our figures were broadly in line with those other studies.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll leave that session there. And I'm delighted to move on to Dr. Paul Leahy, who's going to present the work from Work Package 5 on storage, infrastructure and markets. I had to have a bit of a laugh when I saw in the messaging that was coming up there that Paul's daughter put an apricot in the toaster and tripped all the sockets, and he temporarily had to move to a mobile hotspot. Paul, I think you're back online and ready to go, hopefully. So we'll hand over to you with all that excitement.
Thank you very much, Val, and thanks, Sarah. Yes, I'm back online for now anyway, after a little bit of panic. No more toaster incidents, hopefully. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce today our work in Work Package 5 of EirWind. And in Work Package 5, we are looking at methods of storage, infrastructural developments and market developments to facilitate offshore wind development in Irish waters. And really the focus is about bringing wind energy from Irish waters to markets. Some of these are new markets which will be unlocked and facilitated by new developments which are going to take place in the coming years. So our team for this work package is Joshelle Leguipo, Pedro Pereira, myself, Barry Banbury, Nguyen Din and Im McKeough. So currently, in terms of the background, in terms of the resource and the extent of markets, what I want to communicate here is that the size of the resource in terms of offshore wind in Irish waters, it greatly exceeds the current domestic electricity market. And if we look at what's likely to happen in terms of development over the next decade, the Climate Action Plan published by the Government of Ireland in 2019 sets a target of 70% renewable electricity. A lot of this is going to be coming from wind, and a lot of it is going to be new offshore wind capacity, 4.5 gigawatts up to 4.5 gigawatts of offshore wind. If we look at EirWind's own projections for longer term up to 2050, there's potential for up to 23 gigawatts in Irish waters, and this is current, 2.5 times the current domestic electricity demand. So what's very clear from this is that the size of the domestic electricity market is dwarfed by the extent of the huge resource that we have in our surrounding waters. So in order to bring this to market, what we're going to have to do is that we're going to have to find and develop and incentivize new markets for this resource. Next slide, please. So in terms of what are the current markets, well, we have the traditional kilowatt-hour market of domestic electrical energy demand in Ireland for industry and our public sector and for domestic demand, and that was 42 terawatt hours in 2020. We also, of course, have access to export electricity markets to the interconnectors to Scotland and Wales. There are other markets which wind generators and offshore wind generators can access, and indeed are currently accessing. So there is the capacity payment market, where people are paid in order to provide capacity to generate to the system in order to back up the reliability of the system. And then there are also newer markets, which are system services contracts. And these are very interesting markets because these are products that the grid has created in order to keep a secure operation and keep the 50 hertz stability of the grid, keep it stably operating at fixed frequency. And what's interesting about these is that these were created in response to variable renewables coming on the grid in ever larger numbers. But what's interesting is that we're seeing wind farms now being awarded these contracts. So wind farms are actually part of the solution to this issue of variability. If we look forward, towards 2030 in the next decade, we're beginning to look beyond the traditional kilowatt-hour market and there will be more emphasis on system services. This part of the market will grow. It's a higher value market, so these are more sophisticated products than just commodity energy. So there will be more revenue in these markets. There will be more opportunities for export, but the kilowatt-hour market will grow too. And we can see that according to EirGrid's own projections in their high scenario, there could be up to 12 terawatt hours of additional demand by 2029 due to data centers. And most interestingly for us in Work Package 5, we're very interested in the potential for power to gas as a technology that will allow us to access newer markets for offshore wind. So next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of background on what is power to gas, it's many of you are probably familiar with this technology. It's attracting increasing attention. It's very simple and it's been around for a very long time. You simply use electricity to split water into its constituent molecules, hydrogen and oxygen. So this, as I say, has been around a long time. The technology is mature, but at the moment there is increasing focus on the proton exchange membrane as a particular variant of the technology, which has some attractive properties technically, which are useful for integration with large-scale renewables in hybrid farms which combine wind generation and hydrogen generation. They have good technical characteristics and good efficiencies, around 65%, and they also have attractive ramp up and ramp down capabilities, so they can access those extra value markets of system services, which are going to be an important revenue stream for operators in the future. So basically the principle is that you can take very large amounts of current from offshore wind turbines and drive it through large banks of electrolyzers at the utility scale and generate bulk amounts of hydrogen for new markets. Next slide, please. So what would a system like this look like? So we have our kind of traditional offshore wind farm on the left of the diagram, and then we have two different energy pathways. The first one along the top of the screen is the traditional electricity grid pathway. So that's the kilowatt-hour market serving all the electricity demand in the traditional applications. And then the second pathway is a green hydrogen production pathway, where some, or maybe even all, of the production of an offshore wind farm is diverted into electrolysis and used to produce green renewable hydrogen. And when you do that, of course, then you are creating a new energy carrier or a new vector, and that allows you, because it has different technical characteristics, it allows you to access new markets and new applications. So there are going to be investments needed in terms of technology development, in terms of infrastructure deployment, and in terms of storage in order to access and unlock these new markets and new revenue streams. But this is already underway in many countries around Europe. And the other thing that I think is interesting here, which is going to happen, is that we're going to have to move beyond this concept of wind curtailment, which has been a traditional focus when people think about energy storage or using dispatch down wind energy. Now, this is not really a concept that will apply anymore. We will be designing in these technologies into hybrid wind farms, and all the energy will be considered. It's not like we will be considering free energy that is being refused by grid operators. So this will have to be taken on board in order to assess the overall competitiveness of wind projects in the future. Next slide, please. So looking again at those new applications that can be unlocked by hydrogen. Well, firstly, of course, it opens up transport markets through hydrogen fueled vehicles. It also could potentially open up a heat market because, of course, hydrogen can be used as a heating fuel. Grid system services will still be there, and even though these are electrical products, the technical capabilities of electrolyzers in terms of their fast ramp up and ramp down will mean that a hybrid wind farm, which has hydrogen in addition to wind generation, may be able to access more of those products than a traditional wind farm, which is electricity only. Then, of course, there are hydrogen exports because we can use gas infrastructure to export hydrogen. And then we also have other molecules. So we have interesting opportunities in methanol or in ammonia or in synthetic methane that can be used for downstream products. And of course, the big thing here is that hydrogen is very storable, and this can be very, very useful. It's certainly useful for providing services to the electricity sector, but it's also useful in terms of gas markets as well. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned already, there is every day there are new projects announced and new pilot projects announced around the world. This is a piece of work that a little mini review that just in the last few weeks Pedro has done, looking around Europe and further afield around the world at current deployments of pilot sites where renewables are being transformed into green hydrogen. And you can see that there's a large density of these projects coming on stream in the Nordic countries and in Germany and in Central Europe as well. So there's going to be a very big investment, and we've seen just even in the last few days, the EU in its new Green Deal is incentivizing and providing huge R&D funds. So there's going to be a major emphasis on R&D in this area in the next decade, aimed at scaling up and also fully offshore plants as well, marinizing the electrolyzer technology so that it can actually work completely offshore. Okay, next slide, please. So when it comes to sizing or designing a plant like this, we have a hybrid plant, so it has offshore wind turbines, but it also has electrolyzers. What big scale should you use for the electrolyzers? Should you design the electrolyzers to the full scale of the offshore wind plant, or maybe they should be a fraction of the capacity of the offshore wind plant? And that's something that our researchers Barry and Joshelle are currently looking at. If you take a 492 megawatt wind farm, which is one of our test case scenarios in EirWind, we can look at the overall capacity of the wind farm and the overall capacity of the electrolyzer as we increase on the x-axis there the electrolyzer capacity factor from 0 up to the full 492 megawatts of the wind farm. And you can see that there are some improvements in terms of the effective capacity factor. You're able to absorb more of the output of the wind farm because less energy is being dispatched down as you increase the electrolyzer capacity. But the other thing that you have to consider is that your electrolyzer capacity factor is actually going down because as you increase the size of the electrolyzer, less its capacity factor will be utilized, and this will have a knock-on effect on the economics and the operations of the plant. Next slide, please. And this is something that Pedro is also working on at the moment, creating a version of this very interesting curve which will be applicable for offshore wind developments in the Irish scenario. This is about, again, energy carriers and energy transmission. What is the most cost-effective way to transport energy from offshore wind, depending on the distance that you need to send it? This particular graph here looks only at gaseous fuels, so it's looking at hydrogen. When you have hydrogen, you have a choice of ships or pipelines. You also have the potential for ammonia, converting it into ammonia and accessing ships or pipelines, and you can see that ammonia costs tend to be lower than the hydrogen costs. Well, what's interesting factors here is that you can see that there is at some point a crossover distance here. In this particular study, it was at about 1,800 kilometers, where basically ships begin to look more cost effective than pipelines. We will also include electricity as well when we look at this, so traditional, just pure 100% electricity transmission, which for short distances is likely to be more cost effective, at least in the current scenario. Next slide, please. And in terms of that transmission and accessing the new markets, particularly the export markets, this is just on the right-hand side, the capacity in terms of our interconnections to other bulk energy markets in gas and in electricity, all expressed in terms of gigawatt hours, so we can compare them equally. The interesting thing here really is to show that the capacity of gas interconnection in terms of energy is much bigger than the capacity of electricity interconnection. And that means that there's a good opportunity here to reach export markets through gas infrastructure, as well as the proposed new electricity infrastructure, which is well advanced, particularly the Celtic Interconnector project, which is currently in an advanced state of planning. Next slide, please. So when we look at overall at the opportunities to bring Irish offshore wind to new markets, they fall into different areas. All of these will require attention and support. So the first area is in terms of infrastructure. We have this capacity to export hydrogen through pipelines, but there will have to be some technical measures to increase blend percentage, both in the domestic network and potentially in transmission networks as well, so that we can increase the amount of permitted hydrogen in the mix of existing natural gas networks. The second thing is in terms of electrical interconnection. It's really important in order to reach continental European electricity markets. But of course, we always have to remember too that interconnectors work two ways. And currently, the net flow on our interconnectors is inwards. We expect this will change in time, but it is something to consider that electrical interconnectors aren't always available to serve energy in the direction that you want. Transport markets are a very important domestic market, probably the most important market of all. There's a big potential there, and Shell is currently working on this. We will need to accelerate rollout of a distribution and refueling network of hydrogen stations if we need to deliver hydrogen to vehicles. And then in terms of system services, electrolyzers will have to demonstrate to the grid operator that they can provide these services. So in terms of technology, lots of these projects that are currently underway that I showed on the map around Europe will reduce some of the uncertainty around the offshore performance of hydrogen technology. And they'll also begin to drive down the cost of electrolyzers. And the costs are dropping rapidly, but there's still an uncertainty about how quickly those prices will go down and reduce the levelized cost of hydrogen, which is the important thing for the competitiveness of green hydrogen. So that brings me very nicely to the last point here. The levelized cost is key. We have to compete with the other sources, at least in the beginning, including fossil fuels. And incentives will be needed like any other renewable generation in its infancy. So that brings me to the last slide, and I'd just like to thank you for your attention and thank our industry partners as well. And if there's time, I'd like to take some questions as well.
Thank you so much, Paul. Absolutely loads of stimulating food for thought in relation to imagining future markets and the direction of travel for offshore wind in an Irish context. It strikes me in terms of the quote that if you don't change direction, you'll end up where you're heading. And the course has been set very clearly, and it's very welcome in terms of the climate action plan and the targets for 3.5 gigawatts, possibly 5 gigawatts with regards to the draft programme for government, and the realisation of potential in the Irish Sea in the first instance with bottom fixed, and perhaps a route to market there in terms of domestic electricity, but then big questions in terms of route to market for I suppose offshore wind at scale in Ireland. So there's a need to change course and to start planning now to achieve that into the future. In terms of questions, I have just plucked one question out for you, and would encourage you and other colleagues to be active in the chat room to respond to the questions that are coming in thick and fast. Just let everybody know we will deal with all of those questions and publish them after the event. But Paul, for here and now, can hydrogen produced from offshore wind energy be competitive with other fuel sources, please?
Okay. Well, right now, the the fossil hydrogen can be produced for around €1.50 per kilogram, and of course other fossil fuels are even cheaper. So fossil, we're still in an era of very cheap fossil fuels. The best kind of estimates that we can see at the moment for fully renewable green hydrogen from renewable energy are coming in at around €5 per kilogram. So there is a gap there, a competitiveness gap, but all those improvements that are going to be made over the next decade are going to move to narrow that gap down. And this, I think, is going to be achieved through kind of a mixture of, firstly, cost reductions through scale up and technical improvements. I think reliability is probably a big one in terms of reducing O&M costs for electrolyzers. But then on the other side, there will also be, fossil fuels are going to go up in price. So that gap is going to narrow from both sides. There will be carbon taxes as well, and the grey hydrogen without carbon capture and storage will inevitably see the price go up as a result of that. So looking forward, the EU targets €2 per kilogram for green hydrogen by 2030, which is very ambitious, but they are prepared to weigh in heavily behind that with R&D. So I think we'll see, with a mixture of incentives, carbon taxes and improvements, we're going to see it become close to being very competitive in the next decade.
Exciting times ahead. Thanks a million, Paul. Okay, we'll move on to the final research presentation. I'm going to present a session now on research synthesis on behalf of work that's been done by Dr. Eamon McHugh and myself. Hopefully at this point you'll have understood and maybe come to appreciate the huge diversity of work that's been undertaken within the EirWind project. We've had presentations thus far from many different disciplines. Going back to Nguyen's early presentation, there are over 31 different studies, reports and outputs. Materials will be available on the website before the project concludes at the end of July. And an important date is now the 8th of July, when the work that I'm about to present now will be published by way of the EirWind Research Synthesis Report, which we are describing as a blueprint for offshore wind in Ireland. So what that does is try to pick up all the nuggets from the different research activities and weave a golden thread through them to try and outline a roadmap or a pathway for offshore wind based on what we've learned so far. So the next slide will, I suppose, set the scene. So in terms of the approach that we've taken for the synthesis, Ireland is often described as a small island nation, whereas in fact it is a large ocean state, and our maritime area is over 10 times our land mass. We have some of the best resources in the world for marine renewables. We have an abundance of wind. The Ocean Renewable Energy Development Plan, Mark 1, indicated that there was potential for 39 gigawatts of offshore wind without adverse impact on the environment. But the critical question is how do we bring that energy to market? So we have an abundant resource, but we haven't put the resource front and central in the synthesis. What we've done with the synthesis approach is that we have focused on the market, and the market opportunity is the critical factor for analysis in the synthesis and for unlocking the offshore wind potential in Ireland. So as Paul has said, in terms of the domestic electricity market, there are strong growth trajectories indicated from EirGrid, with drivers such as data centres opening up opportunities for corporate power purchase agreements, drivers, for example, with regards to electric vehicle targets through the Climate Action Plan. We have a target in this country of 70% of renewable electricity by 2030. That's underpinned by the Renewable Energy Support Scheme, the RES, and we're going to see a number of auctions between now and 2027, which will open up opportunities for offshore wind, and we'll see those initial responses coming from the Irish Sea area. But beyond that, and when we generate more offshore wind, the fundamental question is, where will it go in terms of market opportunity? And of course, we can look at electricity export, and we know that we have an opportunity for interconnection capacity of 2.2 gigawatts by 2026. And Paul has described the fact that this is not necessarily a panacea for export. So looking beyond 2030, the critical question is whether the electricity market alone can exploit the resource at a scale to maximise the offshore wind opportunity for Ireland. So we would suggest that there's a strong argument that electricity is the best vector for energy. In terms of getting to market with regards to grid, the supergrid technology is at an early stage of development, and that hasn't been a focus for the EirWind research. At the moment, there's a very important consultation open through the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Energy. It's an options paper for the delivery of offshore wind, and it's an options paper in terms of grid delivery models. So that body of work is going to be extremely important in terms of informing potential route to market and thinking beyond 2030 in terms of new technologies, new interconnectors, or what might be appropriate in terms of electricity. Next slide, please. But an alternative route to market, as Paul has described, is to convert power to gas, and namely hydrogen. And hydrogen has very much been a focus for the EirWind research. There's a number of reasons why we focused on hydrogen. There are more mature, innovative technologies associated with hydrogen production, storage and distribution. The cost of producing hydrogen from renewable electricity is indicated to fall by 30% by 2030. And as Paul mentioned, the EU hydrogen strategy, which has been leaked online in the last few days prior to its launch, also on the 8th of July, indicates that Europe is looking to target 1 to 2 euros per kilogram as the cost of production of hydrogen going forward with regards to research, incentives and supports. It's hugely ambitious. To put that in context, grey hydrogen at the moment costs about €1.50 per kilogram to produce. Blue hydrogen opens the door for green hydrogen, and blue hydrogen is related to the opportunity and the challenge around carbon capture and storage. And a number of the EirWind research consortium members, particularly Equinor, are looking at that area, and Equinor leading a project in the North Sea called Northern Lights with regards to that blue hydrogen potential. Hydrogen is necessary for at-scale decarbonisation of key segments, so in terms of fuel cells for transport, the gas grid and industrial processes. Arguably, electricity and electrification can't do everything, and so we can see also that in relation to hydrogen, existing infrastructure such as the gas heating infrastructure, 40% of European homes currently are heated by gas heating. It currently exists. There are skills and there's regulations that are relevant to this opportunity. And really importantly, as Paul has highlighted, carbon tax and government incentives and supports will have a critical role to play in the detailed economic case for hydrogen replacing oil and gas, for example, in transport and heat going forward. So the next slide, please. So what we have done in terms of the synthesis report is that we have looked very much at the electricity market, and we have looked at the hydrogen opportunity for Ireland. And so you can see from this slide that in the first instance, things are very much dominated by electricity for the domestic market and shifting some electricity via interconnectors. But what we're proposing is that if hydrogen comes into play, and if we can actually act now in terms of hydrogen, that we can start to unlock the potential of hydrogen for the heat and the transport markets at a domestic level, and start gearing up with the opportunity to export hydrogen at scale into the future. So what we've envisaged here is up to 23 gigawatts of hydrogen by 2030. We haven't factored in supergrid here, and it's not necessarily a case of either or. This model in relation to hydrogen and electricity, it stands on its own merit, and it would be hugely complementary to a further analysis in relation to the grid. The aim here was to present a plausible scenario for the analysis and presentation of the EirWind results of the research through the synthesis report. And we aligned very well and drew heavily on the work from Transport Mobility Ireland in relation to the transport aspects. So the next slide. So we've looked at that market opportunity, and we've looked at those market segments, and we've looked out to 2050. And so the next question is, what do we do to achieve those markets? And we have framed recommendations around 3 key production zones to meet the 23 gigawatts of offshore wind. So the next slide. The first production zone is the Irish Sea, and this is characterised by bottom fixed installations, which is currently active now, and we'll see that the main activity in and around this production zone between 2020 and 2035. We have the relevant projects as well as Arklow Phase 2, led by SSC, really shaping what's going on within the Irish Sea. And this is driven very much by the Climate Action Plan targets, and may be driven harder and faster by the programme for government should that come to fruition. What we're seeing in the Irish Sea in general is about 5 gigawatts of offshore wind to the market. And as Jimmy outlined early on, we're seeing a good match in terms of the cost of producing energy from this production zone with what is happening in other parts of the world, and taking into account the factors that distinguish and characterise the Irish situation at present. So we're looking at €65 per megawatt hour for 2025, and a hypothetical project of about 500 megawatts. Accessibility is good. Jimmy gave the figure of 90% earlier on, and the data here from Jimmy et al. Is showing about 90% of accessibility. We're recommending, in relation to the work that Sarah has been done, that there's a huge opportunity for port clusters, and in each of the production zones we're identifying key ports where there's an opportunity for clustering initiatives with regards to enterprise, research, innovation, and Rosslare is an obvious candidate in terms of the Irish Sea, not least because of the intention and the proposal to develop a logistics hub there. And we also saw in the last few weeks the announcement of 80 jobs for Arklow coming from the work that SSE are doing. So the Irish Sea production zone is very much shaped, it's very much known, and there are a number of projects that are underway there. So the next slide moves us around then the coast to the south coast of Ireland, and looking now at the Celtic Sea production zone. This is a zone that we believe can come on stream for bottom fixed and for floating. It's a zone where we're going to see peak activity between 2025 and 2045. A number of projects are already active in this area. So we've got proposals in terms of early stage development and scoping of initiatives from Energia in relation to Helvig, the Celtic Sea Array from SSE, Inishalga from DP Energy, and the Emerald project from Simply Blue Energy. So these are early stage projects, and what's key here is the opportunity around floating. So when we're thinking about offshore wind at scale, we're thinking about floating in terms of the characteristics of the Celtic Sea and the Atlantic, and we're thinking into the future in terms of alternative routes to market for some of this energy production. We estimate about 9 gigawatts of potential for this Celtic Sea production zone. A higher cost of producing energy here, which aligns with the Met Ocean conditions, but still looking at about €74 per megawatt hour, coming on stream in terms of a 1 gigawatt project by 2035. Accessibility levels in terms of weather windows, 84% of the year, so lots to be done to look at trying to bring down the costs and trying to improve automated control and options for accessibility. The route to market is absolutely key here. So there's not necessarily a de facto solution in terms of grid reinforcement or in terms of a second or a third interconnector to bring electricity to France or the UK or elsewhere. We firmly believe that there's an opportunity to link in with the industrial profile of Cork Harbour, and there's a potential to bring floating offshore wind and to connect it with a hydrogen hub in Cork Harbour. And our proposal in the synthesis report is for a hydrogen hub concept of 100 megawatts as a pilot linked to floating wind. And we believe that this is a huge opportunity to really move forward and to start building capacity in terms of the steps that need to be taken to move in that direction. So the next slide shows the Atlantic production zone. And as we sequence around to the Atlantic production zone, this is really the big prize. This is the big ticket item. And you know, things are moving very, very quickly, as I said at the start of the presentation, in terms of technology, in terms of costs coming down, in terms of proposals, in terms of new entrants into the Irish market, looking at this area. We estimate, and probably a modest 9 gigawatts in terms of what could potentially come to market with our market scenarios. The peak activity for this area will be 2030 to 2050, but that doesn't mean we wait until 2030 to start looking at it. We need to start looking at this strategic opportunity for offshore wind from the Atlantic zone now. And this is really the piece that will tip us into that scenario that we outlined at the very start in terms of not just energy security, but an energy export opportunity for Ireland into the future. We can see here in terms of energy costs that we're coming in at about 108 euros per megawatt hour for a hypothetical 1 gigawatt farm coming on stream in 2035. Accessibility, as Jimmy mentioned, becomes an issue in terms of the met ocean conditions here. But it's also an opportunity, because if we can move forward with a pre-commercial demonstrator for this region, then we can start to demonstrate the viability of technology in these harsher conditions. And we can see huge progress in relation to different types of foundations, whether it is semi-sub technology or the pendulum technology that Jimmy mentioned earlier. And the Afloat project is extremely significant in this regard in relation to the demonstration project that is being supported by the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland to bring a 6 megawatt turbine into the AMET site of West Mayo. So what we see here is the potential for a Kickstarter. A strong grid node at Money Point makes this area of West Clare very attractive in terms of getting things started. As I said, the big prize is really post 2040 in terms of looking at bulk hydrogen production, and then the challenge is distribution and access to the market at a competitive price. But we need to set the course, and we need to look at moving in this direction. And in terms of setting the course and moving in this direction, huge work is already underway by multiple stakeholders. Jerry Hallisey and others in Shannon Foyne's port company are extremely proactive in terms of looking at the port capacity and the opportunity to design master plans to be prepared for this opportunity going forward. So next slide. In terms of summarising what we've heard, there are multiple opportunities as well as challenges. So the work from Sarah has looked at job creation, has looked at GVA, has looked at the opportunity in terms of regional development. If we look at that Atlantic production zone, we can imagine and envisage a Western economic development corridor that will have implications in terms of ports and supply chain. That can have implications in terms of community developments. Looking at Michael's work in relation to coexistence with marine protected areas and the opportunity for offshore wind farms to be redesigned almost as marine installation conservation areas. And really that's all about looking at the potential for artificial reefs, whether it is an artificial reef associated with bottom fixed or fisheries aggregation devices designed in and around floating platforms. And of course, the big and really important prize for Ireland in terms of decarbonisation of the environment and being able to meet objectives in relation to climate change, and also in terms of energy security going forward. We do have challenges. There are questions in relation to centralised versus decentralised delivery models. Jimmy has outlined the challenge around the environment, the mid-ocean conditions. Yvonne's work has shown the critical piece that needs to be considered in terms of social license to operate. Jared's work has looked at the data gaps. Paul's work has looked at the energy infrastructure challenges and the necessity to achieve economies of scale. And really importantly, we need extra policy makers. France's work, the work by Francis, indicates that we need 25 to 30 new staff within key government departments and agencies within the next 18 to 24 months, just with respect to business as usual, to be able to deal with the developments around offshore wind in Ireland at present. So where all of that takes us in terms of the next slide are a number of recommendations for offshore wind. So next slide. So according to John F. Kennedy, change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past or present are certain to miss the future. So to facilitate change and the kind of change that we can envisage with regards to our energy future from offshore wind, we need a shared vision. We don't have a shared vision that has been developed with all of the stakeholders, and this is something that would appear to be a priority. So a vision to harness the full potential of Ireland's unmatched offshore wind resource to transform our energy future. Next slide. In terms of the realisation of that vision, we have put together in the synthesis report, and this is a work in progress. This will be finalised within the coming days. It's just to give you a flavour of what's required in terms of ramping up between now and 2030. So this is basically a plan to realise the market segments that we've described in the synthesis report and to activate those production zones that I've walked you through, building on what we've learned thus far within the EirWind project. There are absolutely critical items here. For example, the Marine Planning and Development Management Bill needs to be progressed. The OREDP, the Ocean Renewable Energy Development Plan, is going to be underway shortly, and that's extremely important. From the point of view of communities and community building, there are a number of actions that can be activated. Sarah mentioned the opportunity around a fisheries forum, changes in terms of regulations in relation to fisheries, being able to offer services, for example, in relation to guard boats. The opportunity to look at MPAs in terms of MICAs, marine installation conservation areas. The opportunity to look, as Paul mentioned, at the Green Deal and to really take a strategic approach in terms of helping Europe to realise its targets and putting Ireland front and central with respect to all of the above. So we've outlined this roadmap, and what you can see is that really we need to act now, because it's not really about waiting until 2030 to decide if we want to do, for example, a pre-commercial demonstrator to look at a hydrogen hub in the Celtic Sea linked to floating wind, or if indeed we want to imagine a pre-commercial demonstrator that can start to consider and look at floating off the west coast of Clare or for the Atlantic zone. So it's really about starting now, and a huge amount of the activities and the actions that we describe in the roadmap rest with government, and therefore the recommendation around resources into government is absolutely critical. So through my narrative, I've described the fact that we've got an absolutely incredible offshore wind resource, but unless we have a market, there's no value to that. And even if we look at the market, unless we unlock the resources that are needed to drive us towards that market, then we'll be missing an opportunity. So there's a huge amount at stake here, and there's an enormous opportunity. So in terms of my final slide, it's all about the sequencing, and just to leave you with a key message around the critical path to how we might get to that market scenario of 23 gigawatts that we've outlined. And the critical path, number one, is about extra staffing in relevant government departments and agencies, for example, for consenting. Number two, we need a route to market strategy. We need to take in all of the work that's been done and is underway in relation to grid, in relation to interconnectors, in relation to hydrogen. We need to look, number three, at the opportunities for pre-commercial demonstrators for floating wind in the Celtic Sea and in the Atlantic. Number four, a roadmap with timelines for all three production zones. And number five, very importantly, really getting going now in terms of actions to develop partnerships with stakeholders, fisheries, coastal communities, etc. So that concludes my overview of the synthesis. The opportunity here is for wind to be to Ireland what oil is to Saudi. It's a very rapidly changing area, and there's a huge amount of excitement, but there is a lot of trust to be built and a lot of moving parts to be nailed down within the next couple of years, not years, months, days. So no pressure. I am going to just change tack now. So Michael, we might go to the final slide. Yes. And so we're into our final session. I'll have a look at questions coming in the meantime, and hopefully come back to some of those online, if not for sure offline. But this is a really important part of the day in terms of welcoming our guest speakers. So we've invited a panel to comment on and reflect on all that has been presented during the course of the morning. So for the next 20 minutes, we'll hear from Niamh Kenny, from Sam Roach-Perks, from Anita Holgerson, and then from Martin Finucane. Niamh is the Business Development Manager in DP Energy, who she's been with for more than 7 years. She has huge experience in the renewable energy sector. She's been involved in all elements of business development within the company. Prior to that, Niamh successfully operated her own consultancy business, and she provides support now within DP for all new business development, including emerging markets and new opportunities for DP. So I'm very happy to hand over to Niamh, and Niamh, to hear from you in terms of your commentary, please.
Thanks, Val. I suppose firstly I'd like to thank EirWind and the whole MaREI team for the tremendous work which has been undertaken in the last 2 years. I remember very well speaking to you, Val, more than 3.5 years, I'd say, ago, to discuss this concept, and together with Equinor, we first conceived the idea of a joint industry project. And at that time, I really didn't dare to imagine that it would achieve the level of success that it has, or that the outcome and the deliverables that we've seen would be of such quality and scope. And I mean that quite genuinely. It has been a resounding success with excellent participation from the industry partners and from the advisory group. So I'm sure that I speak on behalf of all of the industry partners in sending a hearty congratulations to you, Val, Eamon, Jimmy, Wynne, and all of the team. It has been a great project to be involved in, and sometimes these things are not, as you know. I suppose one of the core take-home messages of the EirWind project for me has been the importance of joined-up thinking and industry collaboration. Obviously, there's a certain resistance to this sometimes because people are competing for scarce projects and so on. But in this particular project, I think we've gotten beyond that a little bit, because I suppose an early stage in the industry. So the industry has worked particularly well together to come up with work packages that were really meaningful and really useful at the beginning, which has now paid off at the end. The importance of the supply chain has been highlighted through the market and optimization work packages. And the supply chain, as we know, for offshore wind is a complex and multifaceted beast, and many of the businesses and infrastructure will require a long time to build up. And I suppose one of the things that we're very focused on in DP, and all of the industry partners and all of the developers, in fact, in Ireland are very focused on, is the ports. So I suppose it's clear that strategic investment driven by government together with the private sector must be directed into one or more Irish ports to take advantage of the commercial opportunity of delivering up to 5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, obviously pending the outcome of the programme for government talks. So I think that's one thing that we really need to focus on. It's a long lead item, and it will take many years to get the plans together, to get the planning permission, and to get the investment required for a port that could actually do all of the staging and the manufacturing that we would require, which will ultimately optimise the opportunity for Ireland Inc., let's say. EirWind modelling has suggested that by 2030, 2.5 to 4.5 gigawatts of domestic offshore wind could create between 11,500 and 20,500 supply chain jobs. That's a really meaningful number in the context of the green recovery that we all hope for post-COVID-19. And as the supply chain here develops, companies will be able to expand to provide services to the UK market, which obviously continues to have ambitious targets of its own. I suppose to date we've been focusing largely on the legislation and the regulatory framework required to get the industry going. But since we are a little bit behind our neighbours, it may be no harm to learn from some of the valuable work that they've done to increase the value of the supply chain in the domestic economy. The UK sector deal, I think, is well worth focusing on just for a moment. It commits the offshore sector there to increase UK content by 60%, or to 60% rather, by 2030, as well as setting an ambition to increase exports from the sector by a factor of 5 to 2.6 billion in the same period. Now that's a massive number, and I think that the Irish supply chain and the opportunity that offers, including the ports, obviously, is something that we really, as an industry and as companies working together, should really be encouraging government to look at. I know the Irish Wind Energy Association is talking about it, MaREI is talking about it, everybody's talking about it, but it's something that everybody is very motivated about, and it's one thing that the industry can work really closely together on, because obviously there's no necessarily competing factors there. So I think that the government in particular should be thinking about maximising local content and how to optimise local suppliers and businesses to support the sector. And this will have a knock-on effect of increasing community support. I think Yvonne's work on social acceptance already indicates very high levels of support for offshore wind in Ireland, and local jobs, training and opportunities will only increase this figure higher. It's not an easy balance to get right, obviously, but I know that the industry here in Ireland is mature and ready to work closely with the appropriate government agencies to build strong supply chains. And I really would laud the work of IMIN and the Enterprise Ireland network, which is already facilitating business-to-business linkages with relevant UK suppliers with a view to strategic partnerships. And I think you mentioned, Val, in your sum up as well, around the importance of regional development. And again, the importance of that can't be underestimated in looking at the supply chain, because if we can get these jobs, really high value jobs, out into the rural communities where they're most needed, then we're solving two problems with one. And I think that will meet the targets of the regional development agencies as well as the business development agencies. So we shouldn't ignore that opportunity. I think I was looking at the questions and answers as we were going through, and somebody was commenting about the opportunity presented in the Northwest, and that had been sort of more or less ignored in the analysis of EirWind. And I mean, that was quite a deliberate decision, obviously, because we were trying to focus on the East Coast in the first instance, and then the South and the West Coast as the longer term opportunities. And as you go further up the West Coast, obviously the environment is more and more hostile, and so the opportunity for the development there is massive, as we all know, and Killybegs does offer a really good opportunity. But just wanted to respond to that person who was asking, it's not being ignored by industry and it's not being ignored by MaREI, it's just a longer term opportunity, really. So I suppose just the last 30 seconds just to say that we're really appealing obviously to government to get all of the enabling legislation and regulation in place as soon as possible so that we can move on. I 100% agree with your point around getting resources in place. I think there's a massive issue with onboard canola, in particular if they're going to be dealing with a multitude of these applications, very complex applications. So the resources required there can't be underestimated. And finally, just from again from DP's perspective, from my perspective personally, and from all of the industry partners, thanks again for a really great project which we really enjoyed participating in.
Thank you so much, Niamh, for such fantastic feedback, and in particularly really just honing in on critical items to emerge from the presentations this morning, and really flagging that supply chain piece and the role of ports and the need to invest in port infrastructure going forward. I don't think I said during my presentation on the synthesis that our look at Shannon Foyne's port company is sort of suggesting that the potential, again, the big prize there is to be able to move towards manufacturing. And we know from looking at case studies such as the Green Port in Hull, that's really where the rubber hits the road in terms of jobs and impact. You honed in on the importance of the meaningful numbers around jobs, the importance of the collaboration, the joined up thinking, and the implications for regional development. It is an Atlantic zone, quite right that you did signal that the Northwest isn't being ignored, but it's about building the capacity to be able to reach that point of departure. So thank you so much, Niamh, for your comments. I'm going to hand over to Sam Roach-Perks. Sam's a civil engineer who has founded and developed a number of companies in the EU, Asia and the US, including Delaney's Irish pub chain in Asia and Swirish Property in Sweden. He co-founded Simply Blue Energy with Hugh Kelly, his partner, in 2011, which is growing to a team of 26 based in the UK and Ireland. and significantly Simply Blue Energy signed a JV with Total in March this year to construct what will be the largest floating wind farm in the world off the coast of Pembrokeshire. So Sam, we're delighted to welcome you and look forward to your comments.
Thanks, Val, and good morning, everybody, and greetings from just outside the beautiful seaside village of Ardmore on the Cork-Waterford border. I'm actually speaking to you this morning from my farm office, and we've got some land that just goes behind me over the cliff down into Caliso Bay. And certainly as a boy, I used to play walking down that cliff and imagine pirate ships and battleships over the horizon. I never thought I'd be involved in something a little more passive as floating offshore wind and our Emerald project here. I was asked to just basically comment to give my observation on what's happened over the last 2 years in Ireland and offshore wind throughout EirWind's time. Firstly, I have to align with Niamh and say well done, congratulations, and thank you to the entire EirWind team for your hard work and tenacity over the last 2 years. I think one of the things that's jumped out to me, whether it's working with the individual researchers one-on-one or if we're even in our consortium meetings, was the enthusiasm and the passion, not just for this project, but for the marine and for marine renewables. I know I was speaking to somebody, and maybe I think this is for everybody on this call, is we don't just get out of bed in the morning to make a living, we're getting out of bed to make a difference. I put my hand up, Niamh, because I know you and Anita were involved with commencing EirWind. I was very, very skeptical about joining. And that skepticism 2 years ago wasn't because of the cost or where floating technology was at the time. I think it was where I saw Ireland Inc. at the time, and Val, you referred to our Erebus project with Total in the UK, and I was very much focused in the UK. And if we look at where Ireland Inc. was 2 years ago, or if we go back to turn of the century, 2002, Eddie O'Connor and Airtricity came out with, plans for 520 megawatts. Amazing. And 2 years later deployed 25 megawatts, the first 3 megawatt turbines in Arklow. Ireland were the leaders. We're in the front. I'm not really sure how or what happened in the last decade and a bit, but the industry just flew by. And if we just look across the water at our neighbours across the Irish Sea, and you referred to Hull, and see what's happened there and the difference it's made to its people on the East Coast. Now, saying that, my observation over the last 18 months is there's been an absolute sea change in Ireland's interest and Ireland's potential in offshore wind. And it's not just come from EirWind, or it's not just come from the developers or co-developers in EirWind, or even other developers that have come into the market or have been here and didn't join EirWind. I think politically, and you referred to, and some people referred to earlier, the programme for government. But even if this programme for government or tomorrow's vote doesn't happen, there will be a government. And if we go back to February's election, I think every manifesto referred to this opportunity. And so that, and I think we also need to acknowledge the work that agencies and departments have taken on over the last 2 years. They've grasped really hard nettles, from SEAI, the Marine Institute, or the Department of Communications, Climate Action, and Environment in Dublin, the Department of Housing. You've grasped Marine Spatial Plan, you've grasped the framework. So thank you to Martin, Roger, Connor, and your teams. Please finish it. Now is the time. Please finish out that work. Just looking at, I think, Val, the last roadmap, and you referred to staffing, and going back 2 years ago in NRW or in Wales, and we were speaking, NRW, National Resource Wales, kept saying we're under-resourced, and we the industry spoke to the First Minister, Mark Drayford over there, and to Leslie Griffith, and I'm glad to say in the last six months, I think there's been 14 new placements made. So we must do that. So totally aligned there. You referred to the East Coast and the Climate Action Plan, and that we're all aligned and all agree that is the obvious low-hanging fruit. But I'm delighted that EirWind has seen the huge opportunity of floating wind and our huge opportunity as a country. It's not just climate action. This is our opportunity. I sometimes think it's a little bit like looking, if you're in Aberdeen in the 1960s, looking east, or if in Alisund in the west coast of Norway looking west, in Ardmore looking south, or if you're in Galway and Clare, there is the opportunity, and there is the difference, not just for our climate action, but for our people. And that opportunity we just must grasp. And I think the research that's got to be done, we referred to in Work Package 5, it's route to market. Whether we're going to get the energy that we can create and we have as a people to the market in Europe, be it through electrons or molecules or a combination of both or something else, that is the challenge, and that is what hopefully UCC and other research are looking at. So again, congratulations, well done, and thank you very much to everybody in the entire EirWind team. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sam, for a very passionate account of the opportunity, and we're really glad that your scepticism and initial reluctance that Niamh and others worked their charm to make sure that Simply Blue Energy would become partners ultimately in the EirWind consortium. You've commented very much on the sea change, and again just the rapid change that we've seen even in the lifespan of a short project over 24 months. And I think it's been great to have 2 Irish SMEs represented this morning. Before I move on to the next introduction with regards to Equinor, and a very significant multinational in this environment, I think just to pick up on one point that you made in relation to route to market, Sam, I don't think it's come up thus far, so I do need to flag this, that the son or the daughter of EirWind is being designed at the moment, and it's a project called EirWind that is going to focus very much on the route to market piece, and that will be led by Paul Leahy and Windin going forward, and that's going to be a very important next step in terms of the research piece. So if anybody's online and interested in getting more information or thinking about joining that potential partnership through MaREI, please do get in touch with Paul and Nguyen. So I would really like now to welcome Anita Holgersen. Anita is the Business Development Director in Renewables in Equinor. Anita has an incredibly impressive track record in offshore wind and considerable international experience. She was responsible, for example, for the establishment of the Sheringham Shoal Wind Farm. She's worked on the Dudgeon Wind Farm and offshore wind in Japan, among many other projects. She currently looks after Equinor's interests in Ireland. We're really delighted about that, amongst her many other responsibilities. So it's my privilege to introduce Anita, and we look forward to what you have to say, Anita.
Thanks, Val. Thanks a lot. What I want to say is that first, I'm very pleased how EirWind has been performed. I was so happy that we was able to start this project, and you and your team has done a terrific job. Both as I will say, to build connection between the academia, wind farm developers and the government, and also the quality of the job that has been done is very good. I would say also the latest presentation today, all presentation today, really show the quality of the work. I think what you have been doing here, your team has been doing, has an important role in the overall progress in the offshore wind sector in Ireland. And if we look at offshore wind in total, the cost has gone down, the sites has become bigger, and the support regime has also been reduced. This is also something that will happen to Ireland, but first we have to really to move forward in Ireland, and I'm so glad to join that journey. When we started up, we didn't have any partner in Ireland. Now we have signed up with ESB, which I think it's a very good match. We will utilize each other competence, and it's really interesting to be a part of this journey. From my perspective, I started to work with wind in 2010 after many years in the oil and gas business, and moved over to UK with the Sheringham Shoal. And what I saw, and I can say maybe the same as Sam, I was a little bit skeptic, you know, should I start with offshore wind? What is really that? But working closely with local people, you know, to discuss their skepticism and also to see the opportunities and how we together was able to successfully develop the wind farm, and also coming back for visit, and how happy local people are with the wind farm. That's really something I wish we can copy in Ireland. But here we have to work as well closely with local people. And to summarize what I think about the EirWind in the context of the overall progress, I think the coordinated approach to offshore assessment, capturing a wide cross-section of view from the development sector, has been very successful and very important. The academic input that has led to a more rigorous assessment of offshore resource and constraint around east, south and west coastline. It's useful for the project to assess the social impact of new offshore development. I think how you have performed the interview, the facts gathering has been tremendous, and also especially of the fishers, as well as providing useful resources in terms of data, information and analysis. The research has also signposted the gaps in the existing data set. While much of the project was near market in terms of the primary objectives, the hydrogen workstream has provided a solid basis for following up to ensure full exploration of Ireland's offshore wind resource in the medium term. Hydrogen was mentioned at the end of this meeting, and I think that's also something that will, you know, really kickstart now. So offshore wind and hydrogen is a very good match for the future. So thanks a lot, Val.
Thank you so much, Anita, and thank you in particular for that perspective from Norway. It looks beautiful outside the window in the back there. It looks like the sun is shining, but really importantly to have that perspective from Equinor, looking in and being active in terms of what's happening in Ireland. And I very much appreciate the fact that you really flagged in your commentary the importance of working with local communities and the work that's been done in EirWind with regards to the social impact, which is a piece that's very close to my own heart, and I think that is right and important that is flagged. Unfortunately, Martin Finucane has sent his apologies for reasons outside of his control. He's unable to join us, and that's always the risk when you invite a senior government official to the table for an event like this. That said, we have, and I've seen very good participation from government officials and policymakers in the forum today, so we're really pleased about that engagement, and really pleased also, and it's worth flagging, with the technical advisory group and your participation at our quarterly consortium and research meetings. It's been hugely significant to make that link between academic research, industry and the policy. And EirWind served as an opportunity to achieve that. I would like to thank Martin Finucane, who has been incredibly available and accessible, and his team, and all of the officials in the other departments and agencies. And we look forward to the synthesis report and all of the other studies and the data being available for policy consumption and for public consumption as we bring the project to a close. So the project will finish on the 31st of July. Today has been an important milestone. We have another key milestone now in terms of the launch and publication of the synthesis report on the 8th of July that I flagged earlier on. And I think we're doing well in terms of time. I would just like to take this opportunity, most importantly, to thank all of the speakers, to thank all of our commentators on the panel, and all of the research team who've been working extremely hard to provide the most up-to-date material for today's event. And in particular, I really want to thank Michael, Yvonne and Nguyen, that's Michael Sweeney, Yvonne Cronin and Nguyen Din, for their efforts in terms of coordinating the production of this webinar. We had been looking forward to a seminar in the National Maritime College of Ireland, where we would have had a capacity for maybe 80 or 90 people in the auditorium. We had over 300 people registered when I looked this morning, so we've managed to hopefully reach a much wider audience today. Although we would have enjoyed the after party this evening, I think, and long for those days when we can have a bit of a celebration and a get together again. But anyway, thank you to the team. Thank you also very, very much to the MaREI team. It's been incredible to have that support in terms of the backbone. Aoife and Tara in particular, your help is sincerely appreciated, and Gillian and Angela and all the others that are busy behind the scenes in terms of the administration. So thank you for that. With that, I'd like to bring the meeting to a close and thank everybody for their participation. And just to remind you that we have recorded this, we do have slides, and we are capturing all of the questions and answers. All of the above will be bundled and made available on the project website, www.marei.ie/project/EirWind, as on the screen now. So have a great day, everybody, and we look forward to following up. Take care.
The one thing I think is very clear from the project, and congratulations to yourself and the researchers who put it together, it's an extremely comprehensive piece of work. It's covering an awful lot of the areas that we're looking into at this point in time from a policy perspective. I think from a timing perspective, it's really good time to be coming out with the final results. You've just seen that a new programme for government and new government has formed. The government has been very ambitious in signalling increased ambitions for the offshore sector for 2030, but also signalling, kind of the intent to develop our resources in the medium to long term to go beyond that. So I think it's a really good time for a comprehensive project such as EirWind to be published. I think kind of it's a really good input into the policy sector. The very fact that it takes a broad look, not just at the consenting piece, but at the data resource that's out there. It looks at the planning issues. It looks at it from the industry perspective, as well as looking from the legislative and stakeholder interests. So getting the public on side, I think, on a project as big as this, where we're really setting out to develop a brand new sector in an Irish context, is critical. And how all of those different strands come together, I think, is examined quite well in the broadness of the research policy. So it's a really good piece of work, and we very much welcome it. It's great to have the evidence base. There's a lot of policy decisions are currently been taken, and that we need to develop really quickly. We're working on kind of the grid connection policy. We're working on the MPDM bill, which basically is the planning and regulatory piece. And it's really good to have kind of a strong research input into these to inform them, just when they're at the stage where they're pretty important decisions have to be made that will help shape this future. So it's a really good piece of work, and we really value it from our perspective. And it certainly is a piece of work we see that we'll be referring to on an ongoing basis. It's not something I think that you'll just read once and leave down. This is a really valuable piece of work, I think, that will inform us for quite some time to come. So well done, and best of luck with the project, and we look forward to working well with it from there.
Thank you so much, Martin. That is sincerely appreciated. I'm recalling and recollecting as you spoke when we actually wrote the proposal for the MaREI Centre, going back a good number of years ago now, in relation to justifying an investment in marine research to Science Foundation Ireland. and that we really had to focus on the whole notion of research with impact, and in particular looking at the societal and the economic benefits. And I hope that EirWind aligns with that particular vision and those particular objectives as they were set out by SFI at the time. So we look forward to getting the final report published, hot on the heels of the European Commission's publication of the hydrogen strategy next week. We're going to hold off for that to make sure we're completely aligned. And absolutely, I think it's just the start. So thanks so much.